Once upon a time, a tiny house was made with great skill and care. It was part of a world of miniature art, where things were much smaller than usual. Inside this tiny house lived a family. Sadly, the older woman of the family had passed away, and they were on their way to her funeral. Among them was Annie, the daughter of the older woman, along with her husband Steve and two children, a boy and a girl. Annie's daughter, Chaley, was always a bit peculiar. She did odd things, like sleeping in the miniature house even in the cold winter and wearing strange clothes. Despite being a girl, her body was huge, making her stand out. At the funeral, many strangers had gathered to pay their respects. During Annie's speech, her daughter made a strange noise that caught everyone's attention. Annie wore a peculiar pointed locket around her neck, just like the one her mother had worn. The presence of the locket puzzled the strangers. What surprised them even more was when a man smiled at Charlie and she smiled back. After the funeral, the family returned home, where they shared stories about Annie's talent as a miniature artist. But despite her skill, Annie always seemed troubled and sorrowful. Peter, Annie's son, was also peculiar. He struggled with addiction to cigarettes and various drugs. Steve was the most normal member of the family until then, but Charlie was the most unusual of all. One night, as she went to bed, she asked her mother, Annie, "Who will take care of me now that Grandma is gone?" Annie reassured her, saying, "I will take care of you, my dear. I'm your mother. It's my duty." But then her daughter asked a strange question. "But who will take care of me when you die?" Annie was startled by this, but replied, "Your brother Peter will take care of you." Annie explained how much her mother, her daughter's grandmother, adored her, even though she initially wanted a boy. She shared stories of how her mother fed her milk herself and how much she cherished her. Later that night, Annie found a note among her mother's belongings. It was an apology from her mother, mentioning that Annie would be sacrificed for something precious, with a reward in return. Annie realized this was a message meant for her. The next day, tragedy struck when a bird flew into her daughter's classroom window, killing itself instantly. In a bizarre turn of events, her daughter used a pair of scissors to remove the bird's head, keeping it in her pocket as she left. As the family grappled with the loss, they sealed Annie's mother's room. Before doing so, they discovered evidence of dark rituals and signs of black magic, hinting at something sinister within the family's history. Steve received a troubling call informing him that Annie's mother's grave had been desecrated and her body taken. He kept this distressing news to himself, not wanting to burden Annie further. Meanwhile, Annie attended a support group session where strangers gathered to share their deepest thoughts and feelings, finding solace in each other's company. Annie frequented these meetings, finding comfort in sharing her unusual family history. She spoke of her mother's eccentricities, describing her as somewhat unhinged. Annie revealed that her mother had harbored a desire to transplant someone else into her brother's body, a notion that ultimately led him to take his own life. Annie's father also passed away under mysterious circumstances. She recounted her mother's peculiar ability to control men, a power that unnerved her. Annie admitted to keeping Peter away from her mother's influence. Still, she allowed her daughter to be near her, perhaps explaining her daughter's peculiar behavior. Meanwhile, Charlie experienced a strange, bright light in her room, drawing her towards a nearby field where she found a man seated amidst flames. As Charlie observed the man in the field, it appeared he was engaged in some dark ritual. Annie arrived, swiftly ushering her daughter away from the scene. Later, a friend invited Peter to a party. Annie sent her daughter along to ensure he stayed out of trouble. Peter smoked and socialized with his friends at the party while his sister grew bored. She found solace in eating a cake containing dry fruits, which she was allergic to. Quickly, she began to suffocate, causing panic among the partygoers. Peter, in a state of distress, rushed his sister to the hospital, but on the way, an animal darted in front of the car. In an attempt to avoid a collision, Peter swerved, causing the car to crash into a wooden pillar. The impact was fatal, causing his sister's head to detach from her body and fall onto the road. Devastated by the loss, Peter retreated into shock, silently returning home without informing his parents of the tragedy. The next morning, when Annie and her husband learned of their daughter's demise, they were consumed by grief. Annie's sorrow was profound, evident in her continuous tears until the day of the funeral. The family's dynamics shifted dramatically after the incident, with silence replacing communication as they struggled to cope with their profound loss. Annie resolved to return to the support group sessions to alleviate her sorrow. Despite her fragile state, she mustered the courage to leave for the meeting. As she prepared to depart, a neighbor approached her, expressing condolences for her daughter's untimely passing. The neighbor, having experienced her own loss, offered to help Annie navigate her grief. The following day, Annie visited the neighbor's house, where she noticed a familiar carpet at the doorstep, triggering a sense of déjà vu. Before she could dwell on it, the neighbor welcomed her inside, and they engaged in conversation, forging a friendship. During their discussion, Annie confided about her struggles with sleepwalking, recounting a terrifying incident where she almost harmed her children in her sleep. This revelation strained her relationship with her daughter, who viewed her with suspicion and fear. Upon returning home, Annie immersed herself in her art, creating a miniature representation of her daughter's tragic demise. The sight deeply unsettled her husband, highlighting the family's profound distress. One evening, tensions reached a boiling point at the dinner table when Peter lashed out at Annie, blaming her for their daughter's death. Annie, in turn, accused Peter, believing he might have been involved in her demise since they were together when it happened. Their heated exchange distressed Steve, who intervened to calm them down. It was evident that rifts were widening within the family, fracturing their bond. The following day, while shopping, Annie encountered the neighbor once again. The neighbor shared her recent experience of conducting a ritual to communicate with her deceased grandson's soul. Intrigued yet disturbed by the idea, Annie reluctantly accompanied her neighbor home, where the ritual took place, and the neighbor claimed to have made contact with her grandson's soul. Annie felt uneasy about the process, but was persuaded by the neighbor's insistence. The neighbor encouraged Annie to attempt to communicate with Peter's soul using a similar method, assuring her it was a simple process involving reciting mantras and obtaining an item associated with him. That night, Annie experienced a vivid dream while sleepwalking, imagining herself entering Peter's room to find him covered in tiny ants, entering his eyes, mouth, and nose. In the dream, Peter confronted his mother, questioning why she seemed always at odds with him. Annie confessed her inner turmoil, revealing that she never wanted him, as her mother had pressured her into giving birth to a boy. Shocked by her own admission, Annie awoke from her dream, realizing it was merely a figment of her imagination. Upon waking, Annie rushed to her husband and son, sharing her intent to conduct the ritual to communicate with her deceased son, as suggested by the neighbor. As the ritual commenced, eerie phenomena ensued, including Annie speaking in a distorted voice and candles inexplicably igniting. Peter became increasingly frightened, prompting his father to intervene by splashing water on Annie's face, halting the process and bringing her back to her senses. Strangely, Annie had no recollection of the events that had just transpired, hinting at a possible connection with Peter's spirit. The following day, Annie, overwhelmed by distress, vented her emotions by smashing her miniature artworks. Meanwhile, peculiar occurrences continued as Peter's image began to manifest in his diary without explanation. At school, Peter encountered a bizarre phenomenon when his reflection in the mirror displayed contrasting emotions. His real self appeared solemn, while his reflection wore a cheerful smile. Annie, grappling with confusion and a multitude of questions, decided to seek answers from the neighbor's house. However, upon arrival, she found no sign of the neighbors, only black magic paraphernalia and a picture of Peter undergoing a ritual. This discovery raised suspicions, prompting Annie to recall a similar carpet at her mother's house. Rushing back, she searched through her mother's belongings, uncovering several carpets adorned with the same design, hinting at a connection to dark magic. As Annie delved deeper, she stumbled upon an album containing photos of the neighbor woman with her late mother, confirming her involvement in her mother's dark practices. Annie also stumbled upon a book detailing souls, ghosts, demons, and black magic, shedding light on the true purpose behind the rituals. Her mother had been involved in dark rituals to summon a demon. Initially, Annie's mother attempted to channel the demon into Annie herself, subjecting her daughter to immense suffering and torment. Overwhelmed by the ordeal, Annie's mother ultimately took her own life to escape the impending possession. Subsequently, Annie's mother sought another vessel for the demon, targeting Charlie. Despite the traditional belief that the demon would possess a male body, Annie's mother defied convention. Instead, she placed the demon within her granddaughter, explaining her daughter's peculiar behavior. Annie realized that her neighbor, ostensibly a friend, was complicit in her mother's sinister plans, conspiring to fulfill the cult's objective of facilitating the demon's possession of Peter. Annie's investigation led her to the attic, where she made a gruesome discovery: her mother's decapitated corpse, a victim of the cult's ritualistic practices. The presence of blood on the ceiling marked the demon's influence, confirming the evil forces at play within her home. The following day, as Peter sat in class, he was overcome by a strange force, causing him to lose control and injure himself. As Peter's fear intensified in class, his father rushed to school to bring him home, noticing the distress of the other children. Annie, witnessing her son's injured nose, felt a surge of guilt and desperation. She confided in her husband about her mother's involvement in dark rituals and the looming threat of the demon. Still, he dismissed her claims as delusions, fearing for her mental state. Annie pleaded with her husband to burn their daughter's diary, believing it was the key to severing ties with the demon. Despite her insistence, he refused, fearing the consequences. Ignoring his warnings, Annie took matters into her own hands, tossing the diary into the flames. Instead of Annie facing the consequences, her husband was inexplicably harmed, his injuries worsening despite attempts to extinguish them. Tragically, he succumbed to his burns, leaving Peter devastated. As Annie fell under the demon's influence, her actions became erratic and dangerous. She relentlessly pursued Peter, now possessed by the demon, who fled to the attic for safety. Discovering his grandmother's decapitated corpse, Peter was forced to defend himself against his mother's onslaught. A crowd of eerie figures watched Peter closely, intensifying his fear. Breaking through a window, Peter found himself engulfed in a bright light, signaling the demon's possession of his body, mirroring his sister's fate. As Peter observed his mother's strange ascent into the air, he followed her to a nearby small house where a congregation of worshippers awaited. They bowed before Peter, recognizing the demon within him as their newfound deity. Among them stood the neighbor woman, triumphant in achieving her long-held goal of finding a vessel for the demon. With a ceremonious gesture, she crowned Peter, eliciting chants of reverence from the assembled worshippers. Their jubilant celebration echoed through the night as they danced in exaltation at their success. The film concluded with Peter, now possessed by the demon, embracing his newfound role as the chosen vessel for the worshipped entity, marking the chilling culmination of their dark endeavors.